There are some people out there who will tell you that Barry Switzer wasn't very perceptive as the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys. There are some people who will tell you that he was basically Coach Bozo in every sense of the word. But you're not going to hear that from me. That's never been my perception of Barry Switzer growing up, nor is it my conviction now after going through an in-depth research process of his 4 years in Dallas. I think Barry Switzer was who Barry Switzer was. He never claimed to be Jimmy Johnson, and he certainly never gave the impression of pretending to act like Jimmy. As the head coach in Dallas, Barry Switzer was a caretaker. Nothing more, nothing less. He was second in command to Jerry Jones with very, very, very limited authority. But even as a caretaker with both hands tied, that doesn't mean that Switzer was completely dull of mind, that he was totally sleepwalking for 4 years in Dallas. Barry Switzer, to my mind, was as sharp as they come in a lot of ways. And so were his eyes. It was Lincoln Coleman who learned this the hard way during Switzer's first training camp with the Cowboys. Coleman had barely walked through the gates of training camp, had barely even made eye contact with Switzer, when the head coach had already mentally put him in his doghouse. Switzer glanced at Coleman, he saw what he saw, and he didn't like it one bit. Lincoln Coleman was a second-year running back who had gone through spring workouts a bit heavy around the middle, even for a bruising runner of his style. The Dallas coaching staff had given him a prescribed weight number to get down to by the start of training camp. 240 pounds. That was the magic number for Lincoln Coleman. But all it took was one glance for Switzer to know what the team's scales would tell him a few hours later. Coleman was 16 pounds overweight, checking in at 256 pounds. Of all the players that he coached during his 4 years with the Cowboys, I think Barry Switzer was hardest on Lincoln Coleman. Now, admittedly, he could have been harder. He could have taken a tougher approach, certainly. He could have gone full scorched earth policy like Jimmy Johnson might have. But even then, Switzer was still guilty of taking an almost apologetically hardline tone of, let's call it, frustrated negativity where Lincoln Coleman was concerned. As optimistic and positive as Switzer liked to be, try as he might to be gung-ho and wear that sunny smile, he really couldn't find much positive to say about Lincoln Coleman. And, ironically, neither could his coaching staff. But of even more irony was the reality that unfolded during the long weeks of training camp and preseason. Switzer and his coaches, despite all of their words and gestures of criticism and frustration with him, they couldn't find a way to get rid of Lincoln Coleman. This was a summertime story that somehow just seemed to fit right alongside the crazy offseason which had already transpired for the Cowboys. The legend of Lincoln Coleman in Big D actually began the previous season when he was brought up to the Cowboys' active roster in mid-November. And in only his second game with the team, Coleman was thrown into the fire on an icy Thanksgiving runway at Texas Stadium. The Cowboys were caught in a close contest with the Miami Dolphins that day, and with Emmitt Smith struggling with a sore hamstring that he had injured 4 days earlier in Atlanta, Jimmy Johnson thought it best, hey, why not? Let's just give Lincoln Coleman a chance. Lincoln Coleman, despite a slow, lumbering gait, was a puzzle that the Miami defense, for some reason, could not solve. Coleman finished the game with 57 yards rushing on 10 carries, plus another 10 yards receiving. It was a feel-good story, and a homecoming story of sorts for Coleman. He had played high school ball at Bryan Adams in Dallas, and then played in college down I-35 in Waco at Baylor. He spent some time in the Arena League. And then finally, his lucky break came. He got an invite to Cowboys camp in '93, earned himself a spot in the practice squad, and then ultimately his November call-up. His performance that day against Miami in the sleet made him the number 2 running back, ahead of rookie Derek Lassick. 2 weeks later, he scored his first touchdown in the NFL. That was in mop-up duty of a runaway victory for Dallas at the Metrodome in Minnesota. He got a few carries in the divisional playoff win over Green Bay, and even got 1 carry in Super Bowl 28. Things were going good for Lincoln Coleman. But then the offseason came, and Coleman, without the excitement of a game every week and a practice seemingly every day, he apparently had too much time to think. Years later, the story came out that he started suffering from substance abuse in the spring of '94. He gained some weight and developed a little bit of an attitude. Now, coaches didn't mind the attitude so much at spring practice, but they did tell him to drop the weight before training camp began. And Coleman listened not a bit. He showed up to camp at 256 pounds, and that started the ball rolling for this little sidebar drama. By rights, Barry Switzer would have been well within reason to cut him on the spot. I mean, no player, outside of maybe Nate Newton or Derek Kennard, were allowed to report to camp after receiving an ultimatum. Were allowed to report to camp a full 16 pounds overweight. That's just unheard of. And you have to ask yourself why. What was Lincoln Coleman thinking? Maybe he wasn't thrilled about being perceived as the number 3 running back on the Cowboys depth chart going into camp in '94. Maybe he wasn't motivated by the prospects of being a part and a contributor of a team that had the chance to win a 3rd consecutive Super Bowl title. In the end, for some reason, Switzer decided to give Coleman a little bit of rope to play with. Switzer was willing to be lenient, but was insistent that Coleman trim down. Switzer told Coleman that he expected him to be down to 240 pounds by a certain unnamed date that summer. And Switzer kept an eye on Coleman in the following days. During one practice early in training camp, Switzer walks over to him and reminded Coleman to keep slimming down and to beat his weight issue and not let it get out of hand like he had during the spring. And Coleman basically tells his own head coach then to shove off, that his weight was his problem, that he would have the last say on it. No outside interference was needed. Coleman's performance on the practice field during this period of camp was about as lackluster as his attitude. To put it simply, to put it bluntly, Lincoln Coleman was out of shape. Even when in shape, you have to understand, Lincoln Coleman was a slow-moving target. And now he was moving even slower. So he made himself an easy target for any and all big hitters on the Cowboys defense. Whether it was defensive stalwarts such as James Washington or Darren Woodson, or even roster hopeful like Roosevelt Collins. He was the recipient of some big hits during camp, and a large part of it was due to the fact that he was moving so slow because he was out of shape. Now, in the annual blue-white scrimmage, Coleman began to show some of the flashes which had impressed Dallas coaches a year before. He carried the ball 8 times for 37 yards, but Barry Switzer and his staff were more concerned with some other numbers. Coleman fumbled once, and his conditioning, once again, was poor, to say the least. Said Ernie Zampese after the scrimmage, "He has to lose weight. He carried the ball 1 time and looked like he played 3 games." Now, Zampese, of course, was in his first camp as the Cowboys' offensive coordinator. He was the new guy. He wasn't familiar enough yet with the legend of Lincoln. Joe Brodsky, on the other hand, was. Brodsky had been Coleman's position coach ever since Lincoln showed up in Dallas. He had seen this act from Coleman before. After the scrimmage, this is what Brodsky said. "Oh well, Lincoln's Lincoln. He makes 3 or 4 good runs, then he gets tired, the ball goes on the ground, and you're in trouble." Despite scoring 2 short touchdowns in a July scrimmage against Houston, Lincoln Coleman's stock continued to nosedive. The preseason opener versus Minnesota came up. Coleman piled up just 28 yards on 16 carries. And, as if that stat line isn't poor enough, just consider this. Consider that 25 of those yards came on 3 rushing attempts, meaning that On the other 13 carries, Coleman totaled just 3 yards. The conclusion from such a performance was unanimous among Cowboys coaches. He still needed to lose weight. But from that exhibition opener against the Vikings came the biggest piece of news that Coleman's career had received in a long time. After the game, it was announced that Derek Lassick would likely miss the entire '94 season due to a torn quadriceps tendon above his right knee. Lassick had went down, crumpled over on the turf without contact while covering a kickoff. Derek Lassick had started the first 3 games of the 1993 season due to Emmitt Smith's contract holdout. Lassick totaled 187 yards in those games. He scored 2 touchdowns, and Dallas compiled a 1-2 record. And though he had struggled in the second half of his rookie season, the Lassick that Barry Switzer had watched during his first 4 months on the job was a shoo-in to be Emmitt Smith's backup in '94. He was the number 2 guy. Now, with him set to be on the sideline for the foreseeable future, Jerry and Stephen Jones, along with Switzer and also scouting director Larry Lacewell, they started mulling over external options intensively. They were leaving no stone unturned. Of the names that came up, Houston's Lorenzo White and New England's Leonard Russell were having contract difficulties and could, in theory, possibly be available in a trade. The Philadelphia Eagles had recently cut Heath Sherman, and the Rams had recently waived Russell White, who had been a third-round pick in the 1992 draft. But no matter how many names, and no matter how many ideas Jerry and Son and staff considered, they kept coming up against the same problem. The Cowboys had very little to almost no room under the salary cap to play with. And because of this, the Cowboys thought it in their best interest, at least in the short term, to focus on finding a solution from within their own walls. Jerry and the rest of the front office would compile a list of running backs to pursue if they should become available, but in the meantime, Switzer was being asked to simply coach up who he had on this team right now. That last part there, it sounded plausible. I mean, hey, it was time for the coach to coach, right? But when the name of the Cowboys' new number 2 running back came up, Lincoln Coleman, Switzer seemed hesitant to even consider going into the regular season with him as Emmitt Smith's backup. He wasn't excited at that thought at all. Not that he was giving up on Coleman's career in Dallas just yet. Switzer had quite a lot to say about Lincoln Coleman at this stage of the ballgame. But first things first. "I promise you," said Switzer, "we will make Lincoln Coleman smaller. But the fact he's going to be in a number 2 role, he must get in the best condition he can. He always gives us 3 or 4 plays, and it's all downhill from there because of a lack of conditioning and fatigue. That hurts his performance. He's never played in the 240-pound class, and he has to be that or under for him to be a number 2 back for us. He understands where we're headed. He has to step up and make things happen for us." Coleman was competing with 2 other players in camp for the rights to back up Emmitt Smith. Mark Mason was a rookie free agent from Maryland, built in the same kind of mold as Emmitt Smith and Derek Lassick. He was an all-ACC player in college. Mason was a small, shifty little runner who had impressed Cowboys coaches during the summer. He had even led the team in rushing with 47 yards against the Vikings. But even though Barry Switzer seemed intent on throwing compliments Mason's way at every opportunity, the general consensus around camp was that Mason was a long shot to make the roster. And the same could be said for Tony Richardson, another rookie. He had been a really speedy fullback in college at Auburn, and he was trying to make the transition to tailback with the Cowboys. Again, another long shot there. Barry Switzer decided to hold Emmitt Smith out of the second preseason game versus the Raiders for precautionary reasons. So, Lincoln Coleman got the start. Ever since Lassick's injury, Switzer had been re-emphasizing the need to just get through the preseason without another Cowboy going down with injury. Be safe, was the message from the head coach pretty much. Which apparently was a message that meant very little to Troy Aikman. The lasting memory from this game for Cowboys fans against the Raiders is Aikman being popped and upended at the goal line to score a touchdown. Switzer noticed, But I wonder if Lincoln Coleman noticed, because it's really too bad that Aikman's competitive spirit didn't rub off on Coleman that night. Against the Raiders, Coleman endured another dreadful outing. He totaled just 36 yards on 17 carries, and his longest run of the night was for 8 yards. And Switzer, after this game, he didn't even care to mince words. Said Switzer, "I seen him do good things. I'm just wondering if he can hold up over the long haul. I don't think any of us on offense feel he can right now." But there was an alternative theory to consider when trying to solve the riddle of Lincoln Coleman, and Dallas Morning News columnist Blackie Sherrod thought it had some merit. Wrote Blackie Sherrod, "Perhaps the Cowboys have discovered a new specialty player to be used like a fire extinguisher only on certain occasions, such as Lincoln Coleman, designated icy field runner." But Blackie couldn't have been more wrong there. Not only was Coleman adept at running on ice, but he also proved equally as good plowing through the mud. On a rainy evening in Mexico City, before a Monday Night Football audience, Lincoln Coleman was easily the Cowboys' best offensive player. He rushed 9 times for 41 yards in as classic a mud hole as the modern NFL is ever likely to see again. Joe Brodsky, the running backs coach, after the game, it was as if he was thinking, gosh, if only they could duplicate such conditions at Texas Stadium. But he knew they couldn't. Said Brodsky after the game in a very ho-hum manner, "Well, this is Lincoln's turf. Put him in slop, put him in snow, and he becomes a player." But wouldn't you just know it, the evening couldn't have gone off without a slip-up of some kind. Early in the game, it was Lincoln Coleman who slipped in the mud and bumped into Troy Aikman, leading to an errant throw and an interception. The final 2 preseason games were of a very familiar tune. Coleman occasionally found some daylight, but the huffing and puffing would soon start, leading to a total of 3 fumbles. One of these fumbles was recovered by a Dallas offensive lineman, Ron Stone, for a touchdown, for what it was worth. Against Denver, it was reported that Joe Brodsky and Ernie Zampese both took turns basically dog-cussing Coleman at one point during the game. Not that it mattered, or that Switzer even cared to watch anymore. Switzer had to admit the truth at this point, mainly that the lack of depth behind Emmitt Smith was a big concern for the Cowboys going into the regular season. And he gave every indication that he meant it wholeheartedly, because the truth was obvious by now. Blackie Sherrod, he wrote this after the preseason. "Among the few points proven in Cowboys' long exhibition season, Lincoln Coleman ain't the answer." But here's where the story gets really bizarre. The Cowboys' intent was to move on from Lincoln Coleman. Everyone in the building, I think, was on board with that plan. Tops on the Cowboys' list to acquire was Cleveland Gary, who had been cut by the Rams after the final preseason game. Dallas wanted him to back up Emmitt Smith, starting with the season opener in Pittsburgh. They talked with Gary. Gary seemed eager to come. It was going to happen. Now, with Gary supposedly on the way to Dallas, the Cowboys signed Lindsey Chapman as a reserve. Chapman was a running back who had recently been released by the Jets. But then, out of the blue, Gary had an emergency appendectomy, leaving the Cowboys completely in the lurch. So, one day after signing Lindsey Chapman, they released him. Now, the Cowboys are basically forced to travel to Pittsburgh with Lincoln Coleman on the roster, which is what happened. Coleman carried once against the Pittsburgh Steelers for 8 yards. On the Tuesday following the Steelers game, the Cowboys had developed another plan. They were going to poach William Bell off the Redskins practice squad and make Bell Emmitt's backup. So the team cut Lincoln Coleman. And then, immediately following that move, the team re-signed Lindsey Chapman. But word got back to Redskins Park of what the Cowboys were planning. So Washington head coach Norv Turner quickly decided to make room for William Bell on their 53-man roster, effectively eliminating any chance the Cowboys had of signing him. Having missed out on Bell, the Cowboys decided, you know what, let's cut Lindsey Chapman again. So, The Cowboys had to go crawling back to Lincoln Coleman then and beg him to come back to the team. Coleman agreed to come, but with a condition. He would only sign back on if the team guaranteed him a roster spot for the remainder of the 1994 season. Jerry Jones agreed to the deal. What else could he do at that point? And that's how Lincoln Coleman made a go of it with the Dallas Cowboys in 1994. In the summer of 1994, Lincoln Coleman was a player that nobody wanted, but a player that nobody in Dallas could seem to figure out how to get rid of.